broken it up into sections. So first of all, I'm going to focus on Visual Studio generally as a topic. So there's been an awful lot of significant focus on developer tooling for the last year or two. You've probably noticed that. There's been an awful lot of focus. This time last year at the conference, we announced for the first time the ability to use Visual Studio not only to develop Synergy.net applications, which has been present for quite some time now, but also to develop traditional Synergy applications. And there was an awful lot of interest in that. The support we announced last year was experimental. It's kind of formalized now and officially got supported in the B release later on last year. And we've obviously been continually focusing on probably the biggest single focus for the last 12 years since the last conference on really formalizing and structuring and improving that experience. And it really has turned into something really very powerful. So regardless of what type of DBL development you're doing, what type of Synergy development, we really think that Visual Studio is really the IDE of choice, pretty much almost without exception, regardless of what kind of development you're doing for which platforms. And you'll see some announcements coming out later in the conference that will help to highlight how that is the case. Last year at the conference, we announced what we tended to refer to as experimental support for supporting the Universal Windows platform for the first time. If you're not familiar with the Universal Windows platform, it's Microsoft's flagship environment for building, well, firstly, desktop applications. It's the currently developed and supported mechanism for implementing desktop UI, but also gives you the ability to target other kinds of platforms as well. Platforms like the Surface products and mobile devices, and even into things like HoloLens and Xbox. Obviously less of a business interest there, but certainly HoloLens, for example, starting to take traction in some industries. When this platform first emerged in Windows 8, Modern Apps or whatever it was called back then, that it turned into UWP, there were an awful lot of restrictions and things that made it kind of somewhat difficult to adopt that platform. It was very much a sandbox environment that it was tough to get outside of. And Microsoft have done a really great job of relaxing a lot of those things and just eliminating a lot of those restrictions totally, such that UWP now is a very realistic platform for building all types of applications, certainly including business applications. And there are customers in this room who are doing exactly that. So there's 2 project templates available in Visual Studio. You can create with Synergy.net both universal applications and universal class libraries. And also if you've got code that needs reusing in a wider scope than that, you can also use Synergy portable class libraries, where UWP is one of the platforms that you're able to target with that portable class library. There is a slight difference for some of you. If you do get into Universal Windows, then you will be using our device licensing environment. So it's not traditional Synergy runtime licenses obtained from a Synergy license server. It is a cloud-based licensing scheme where the device checks in and verifies its license periodically and things like that. So that's a little bit different, but all of that support is built into the standard project templates. Another major focus of the C release was to formally support Visual Studio 2017, which was released back in March. Microsoft really quickly realized they still had some fairly major issues once they released Visual Studio 2017, particularly in the area of the XAML designer and editor. So their first major update, 15.1, came very quickly after. It was about a month after the product was initially released. So we took that and we basically imposed a requirement. So if you want to go to Visual Studio 2017, that we do strongly encourage, it's a great environment now, but you do have to be on not only 2017, but update 1 of that product, so the 15.1 release. Our 10.3.3c environment is what you will need to be if you want to support 2017, and it will require that you're on that .1 update. And consistent with our policy that's been in place since we supported Synergy.net development, we support the current version of Visual Studio and 2 versions back. So that means that earlier this year, the support for Visual Studio 2012 was removed from the product. The March developer build of the Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio removed that support for that old version. Some specific things that have changed in the area of Visual Studio. A lot of work went into the formatting environment and how code indentation works and how the editor responds when you type in code and hit enter and what gets indented and what doesn't and all of that kind of thing. A lot of us were using Workbench for many years. We had those 4 styles that you could pick from, and one of them was usually fairly close to what you wanted, but not always exactly right. In Visual Studio, this dialogue has been present for quite some time, and it really gives you fine-grained control over exactly what gets indented, what doesn't get indented, and you can pretty much manipulate the settings in this dialogue to achieve pretty much whatever you want. And a lot of work in the latest release went into really improving this, adding a few more settings and really nailing it down. And it really does work very, very well now. So it should be pretty possible to review your settings in here and get Visual Studio doing the indentation pretty much exactly the way you want it. Also, bear in mind, in Visual Studio, we do have the beautifier tool. So once you've defined that style, if you've got a piece of code that isn't quite right and isn't quite flowing according to your requirements, you can hit a couple of keys and it will re-indent that code according to the preferences that you've now set up in the environment. Another new feature in version 10.3.3 of Synergy is the Visual Studio repository project support. I'm just going to briefly mention some of this stuff here because Marty and Jeff have got subsequent sessions on the subject of Visual Studio, so I'm not going to go into depth about any of these features in particular, but just to mention that there is now an additional project template in Visual Studio under the Synergy folder in the new project dialog. It is applicable for both Synergy.net and traditional Synergy projects. And what it essentially allows you to do is manage your Synergy repository environment within the context of a project. You can use it in one of two ways. You can either use it in a schema-centric way, where you provide a repository schema to the project, you just add the file into the project, and the project, whenever a build is required, will take care of loading that schema into the repository so that you can manage the repository through editing the schema file, essentially, which a lot of you do. And it will take care of producing the actual repository data files, or you can just point it at the repository data files and continue to manage those data files through the repository UI. Some of you are in the habit of doing that. And in which case, what the project really does is just give you a referencing mechanism. So the idea is once the repository project knows about your repository, you reference the repository project from all of your other projects, and it makes the repository available to those other projects by setting the appropriate RPS mfill, RPS tfill, all of that kind of stuff. So generally, you remove those settings from your environment and let Visual Studio manage that environment through its referencing mechanism. Another thing, this one's not brand new, but I certainly wanted to call it out because this was something that was introduced as part of the experimental support for traditional Synergy in Visual Studio. It was always one of the problems that I found, certainly, that there was no environment-wide way of setting up the environment within Visual Studio. Like in Workbench, you could set environment variables on a project-by-project basis, but if you wanted something to be applicable throughout your whole environment, what you would have to do is set it up outside of the environment before you launch Visual Studio, or duplicate that setting in each and every project in the solution. So as we introduced support for traditional in Visual Studio at this time last year, we had this new thing called the common properties. And this basically gives you a way of specifying environment variable settings and then opting into those settings in, at the time, any number of traditional Synergy projects in your solution. Very pleased to announce that since the A release, has been implemented across all of the Synergy project types now, .NET and traditional. So you can now have a single coherent set of settings that are just in place whenever you open the solution. All the projects that opt in have those same settings, one place to manage them. Very nice enhancement. Speaking of traditional Synergy in Visual Studio, I already mentioned it was technically a pre-release kind of thing in 10.3.3. We've fully supported it in 10.3.3b, and quite a number of enhancements specifically in this area in the very latest release that's coming out today. A lot of work gone into improved code navigation and IntelliSense, and in particular, an awful lot of work has gone into the debugger, both in the Visual Studio environment itself and in the underlying traditional Synergy debugger. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But the debugger really has come together now as a very nice, very usable environment. There were a few issues previously. It was a little bit of a challenge sometimes, and it didn't always give you quite the information you wanted when you hovered over variables and stuff like that. But it's actually coming together very nicely now, and it's a very usable environment. Again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about specifics because Jeff has a session on Thursday all about the whole debugging experience in Visual Studio and what you can do with it. We've also done a lot of work on performance. One of the challenges we had in the early days with these products was some of our customers with very large environments and ELBs with thousands of routines in them and things like that. There were some fairly significant performance issues. Prototyping took a long time. The compiler took a long time, sometimes in some of those environments, and work's been done in both to really speed things up. Some of the changes we've seen, I made a note here somewhere. A couple of examples for you. There was one particular customer case that took, when you forced a rebuild of their whole environment, it used to take 20 minutes. That's now down to 2 minutes and 45 seconds. And there was another customer that we worked with that was taking 45 minutes to build the whole environment from scratch, and that one came down to about 10 minutes. It's an ongoing process. There's some things you can do certainly to help with that, and we'll touch on those as we go through later sessions, but like I say, it's coming together really well. In traditional Synergy in Visual Studio, if you're not familiar with it, then basically there's a little tip I would give you, which is something that we added support for, I forget exactly when, but sometime since last year. There's a subtle difference between the way that object library and executable library projects work in Visual Studio. With an object library, the compiler is used to compile individual sources into individual DBOs, and therefore if you edit one file, only that one file gets compiled. Because of the nature of an ELB, what we do whenever an ELB needs building, we use the compiler one time and it compiles everything together in one compilation unit. So basically you make one edit and everything is compiled in an ELB project, which clearly can take some time. So the new feature is you can now define an ELB project that doesn't actually have any code in it, but simply references an OLB. So you get the build experience of an OLB, but the output is an ELB, which is a great tip and a great way of doing it, especially if you've got very large ELBs. Make an OLB of them, and then make an ELB from the OLB by referencing that project. An awful lot of work's gone into the Visual Studio debugging environment. In particular, the ability to examine things and hover over things and making sure the locals window is picking up on all the right things and showing you all the right values and responding quickly as well. Some of this was as a result of work in Visual Studio, but also this is driving, when you debug in traditional Synergy in Visual Studio, it is running the traditional Synergy debugger under the hood and using the remote debug, the telnet into the debugger environment and just feeding commands into it. So that locals window, you can probably imagine, is constantly examining things to figure out what's changed. So a lot of the benefits have also come from some fairly significant redevelopment of the underlying debugger itself and tuning performance there. But if you haven't tried it recently, I'd strongly encourage you to give it a try because it really is coming together as a very nice environment. We don't tend to care that much about installation changes as long as things work, but there have been some changes in the Synergy DBL integration installation. It's the first of our installers to use our new environment based on the Wix environment, not the old Install Shield tools. But the changes that you will notice is that now when you install SDI, if you do have multiple installations of Visual Studio available, previously it would just go ahead and plug our tools into all of them. But if you only want to install, maybe you've got 13, 15, and 17 installed and you only want to install the tools into the latest version of Visual Studio, now you can pick which versions get installed. You might also notice that there's an option in that list for the MS Build components. That is automatically selected. You can't deselect that one, but you can unselect all the Visual Studio installations. So what that allows you to do is only install the MS Build command line build tooling. So if you have dedicated build servers where you don't want all the Visual Studio integration, but you just want to be able to run a build offline, then that will allow you to support that kind of environment. In terms of migrating to Visual Studio for development, some of you joined us for the post-conference workshop last year and went through that process with us. The biggest thing about going to Visual Studio for development in traditional is that it does require a strongly prototyped environment. So there is some work in getting there if you're not in a strong prototyped environment already, and clearly in that area there can be a little bit of pain. We recognize that. We're trying to ease that pain as much as we can. But also I want to remind you guys that although there's some pain, there's an awful lot to be gained. It really is a fabulous environment. It's pretty hard to imagine how productivity couldn't absolutely increase once you get there. And the access to really strong tooling like integrated debugging and total version control integration and all of that kind of thing just really makes it a no-brainer. So even if you tried it and didn't have a great experience a year ago, give it a try again because things have changed and we're really focused on making it a pleasant experience. There will be a little bit of work though.